Yes, even I can suss out that technology. Yeah, quite a complicated passage, so hopefully we will unpack it so it makes sense. What Emma didn't say was that prior to our week in Greece, we had 6 days with our kids and grandkids in Dorset. So that's why we needed the week after to sort of rest, really. Like we got. It will be 5 soon, but at the moment it's 4 grandkids under 4. So it's pretty full on. And even as we were just sitting here and worshiping and enjoying God's presence, I thought, do you know what? The different congregations of KCC are a bit like my grandkids or my kids. They're all different, but I love them all the same. And I don't know what you love about Totton, why you come to Totton especially. I'll give you 3 reasons I thought of this morning. Number 1, better coffee. The coffee is amazing here. Number 2, I love the acoustic vibe in worship and we can all hear one another sing. Isn't that fantastic? And I love the fact, basically, I know everyone in the room. So it's different at Hedge End. It's louder. Coffee ain't so good. You can't necessarily hear yourself sing quite so much. But it's brilliant. But whether it's Hedge End, whether it's 9:15, whether it's 11 o'clock, whether it's Totton at 10:30, or whether it's next year as we launch Western, we're one big church family. We celebrate all God is doing here. And we really do. I must just say as well, Psalm 40 that Emma started with this morning always makes me smile. You lift me up out of the miry pit and you set my feet upon a rock. About 20 years ago, I was in eastern Ukraine with a friend who was quite posh. And the eastern Ukraine, where we used to go, you can't go there anymore. Obviously, it's war-torn. It's horrible. I've been to many places around the world. It's probably the worst place I've ever been. And they didn't have proper toilets. They had a hut with a pit and a plank with a hole. And my friend was going to the toilet and he hitched up his trousers, and out of the back pocket of his trousers fell his passport. And it headed towards the hole. And at the last minute, he scooped it up just before it disappeared. And he said at that moment, Psalm 40 came to me. He drew me out of the pit, out of the mud and the mire, and he set my feet on a rock. And he said, my passport was so valuable to me, I would have got in the pit. How on earth otherwise was I going to get home? And you think it's a bit crude, but the stark reality is God in Christ got in the pit for you and me. It's amazing, isn't it? So, where are we this morning? We are in Romans 7. And I was with you not too long ago, wasn't I, when we were looking at Romans 4. And the whole point about Romans 4 is it is a diversion from Romans 3 that is a teaching illustration. Romans 3, the main point is we are justified, we are made right with God, we are counted righteous through what Jesus did. And then you get to chapter 4, and the example that Paul uses, the illustration, is Abraham. Abraham was a man of faith who was declared righteous by God, not on the basis of his circumcision, his deeds, but by his faith in God. Yeah, the one, I gave you 3 great things about Totton. The one really bad thing, that's totally opposite of everything that we believe. We're not going to try and be the best we can, because if we do that, we'll end up in hell. We put our faith in Jesus, and that's the basis of what Paul is teaching in Romans 3 and 4. Romans 7, he's giving another illustration based on what he's taught in chapter 6. So chapter 6 is all about union with Christ. We are united with Christ through his death, burial, and resurrection. And the illustration, an example of that, is baptism. We go down into the water. Our old life is dead. We come up out of the water. It's a picture of being raised with Christ and seated with him in heavenly places. And then you get to chapter 7 and he gives the illustration, which is marriage. And normally when marriage is used in the Bible as an illustration, it gives a really positive spin, because marriage is a good idea. It's God's idea for how we as human beings will flourish relationally and how we will raise children. But in Romans 7, the passage that we heard, it's not a very happy marriage that Paul is talking about. It's not very pretty at all. It's actually an unhappy and loveless marriage. And in this context, divorce is not an option. So the two parties are lumbered with one another. And the only way out of this horrible marriage is for one of the partners to die. That's the picture that Paul is painting. And the picture is of me and you as one party in the marriage, and the other party in the marriage is the law of God. And basically, as I said a moment ago, death and new life is the main picture and teaching point in chapter 6. I'm united with Christ. He died, I died. He was raised from the dead. I've been raised from the dead. So Paul talks about this theme of union with Christ. I have been co-crucified, co-buried, co-raised, and co-seated with Christ. But then you get to verse 2, and Paul talks about what it means to live under the law. Paul says it's like we are married to the law. And it's not a very happy marriage. On the one hand, my husband ticks all the right boxes. He's perfect. He never, ever puts a foot wrong. But actually, in many ways, that's part of the problem. It's a difficult marriage. It's a horrible marriage to live in. He's overbearing and demanding as a partner, always telling me what I should and shouldn't be doing. He is constantly fault-finding. He's always telling me my failures in the relationship. And of course, he never, ever puts a foot wrong. He'll never lift a finger to help me. And he will never, ever die. So I'm trapped, says Paul, in this relationship. One or two people are thinking, is that my marriage? No, it's not. It's an illustration, okay? The law has incredibly high demands. The very first commandment, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Have no other gods before me. And we fall foul of the very, very first commandment, let alone the other 9. In fact, the law, says Paul, provokes me to sin. Don't know whether you've ever been to one of those posh Oxbridge colleges. So our daughter got all her mother's brains, so she went to Oxford. She was at the college where David Cameron was. And she actually had Cameron's room. And I said, you know it's Cameron's room because if you look under the floorboards, you'll find illicit substances. But in the college, you've got a perfect lawn. And you've got a sign that says what? Please keep off the grass. What does that make you want to do? Of course, you want to put your foot on the grass. That's exactly what Paul is saying here. The law actually provokes me to sin. It's a sure sign that I will cross the line. The law has no power whatsoever to enable me to live a life to please God. There's nothing wrong with the law. In fact, the psalmist says, the law of the Lord is perfect. God's law is holy and perfect. But it doesn't give us a power to live a life that pleases God. So one famous 17th century writer put it in a little poem. He says this: "Run, John, run, the law demands, but gives me neither feet nor hands. Better news the gospel brings. It bids me fly, but gives me wings." So the gospel actually sets a higher standard, but it gives us a power to live. See, I used to be a good 400-meter runner. I was my county champion. You might not think that now, but I was. I was my school cross-country champion. And before I had kids, I used to run half marathons, and I used to run them quite quickly. I was pretty fast. But just imagine for a moment that I am told that at my age and in my condition, I have to run a marathon next week, and I have to do it in sub 2 hours, 20 minutes. It's just not possible. It is just not possible. My body is too old physically. I haven't done the training. I wasn't born at altitude like almost every top marathon runner in the world today. It simply can't be done. No matter how hard I try and how much effort I put in, I cannot reach the required standard. And the problem in terms of keeping the law is entirely my end. It's about the sinfulness of my heart, my natural tendency towards wrongdoing. So I have this natural tendency to put my foot on the grass when the sign says, "Please don't." And I'm trapped forever. The law's never going to die. I tell you the truth, says Jesus, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest detail of God's plan, God's law, will disappear until its purpose is achieved. So although on the one hand, our old husband, the law, is perfect, we know instinctively that it's not a good relationship. It's a horrible, controlling and abusive relationship in many ways. Janet and I used to work for someone many years ago in a previous church that no matter what question he asked you, it didn't matter what answer you gave him, he would shout back at you, "You're wrong." Now, actually, in many other ways, he was a good boss. So Janet and I used to laugh about it. I don't know how many times over our married life has one of us asked a question of the other, and the other one jokingly will come back, "You're wrong." And we laugh about our previous boss. But actually, just to be constantly drip-fed this negativity is not a great way for us to live. So we need to understand what Jesus has done that changes everything. First of all, we need to understand we died. You died. Remember where I started this morning with Romans 6, union with Christ. All that happened to Jesus in his death, burial, and resurrection happened to you and happened to me when we put our faith in Jesus. I have been, says Paul, crucified with Christ. So he writes in Romans 5, "So my dear brothers and sisters, this is the point. You died to the power of the law when you died with Christ." The power of the law is broken in our lives when we become a Christian because our old life dies. So Paul says in Galatians 2:20, "I've been crucified with Christ." Let me try and illustrate it for you. Let's imagine that you sign up to join the army and you're a private. You sign up for, let's say, 6 years. Every day for 6 years, you have orders barked at you by your sergeant major. Quick march, attention, get out of bed. You're on a cross-country run. It's 5 o'clock in the morning. I want you on full dress parade tomorrow morning. I want your uniform absolutely spotless. What do? You obey because you are part of that order of things. You've signed up into the army. But there comes a moment where your 6 years in the army comes to an end and you go back into civilian life. Let's imagine a scenario where a couple of days after you've left the army, you're walking down the road. You're not in uniform anymore. You're in jeans and you're in a t-shirt. And you suddenly hear the sergeant major barking orders. Attention! What do you do? Absolutely nothing. You ignore him, don't you? You don't listen to his shouting and screaming because you have been discharged. It no longer applies to you. You've now entered a whole new way of living. You are, as it were, dead to the army. That way of life has come to an end. You're now living, says Paul, under the grace of God. Now, let me just explore for a moment or two the subject of what the New Testament tells us about Jesus and the law. Because on the one hand, Jesus perfectly fulfills the law. He never puts a foot wrong. John 8:46, Jesus says to the Pharisees, which of you can convict me of sin? So Jesus is spotless regarding the law. But on the other hand, Jesus takes the full judgment of the law upon himself by dying in our place on the cross. He bears our punishment. God made Christ, who never sinned, says Paul, to be this offering for our sin so we could be made right with God through Christ. So Christ at the cross takes the full punishment of the law that was handed out towards us so we can receive his perfect righteousness, his right standing before God. I think for me, one of the best illustrations of this in the whole Bible is the Jacob and Esau story. The father, Isaac, has two sons. He has a son called Jacob, the youngest son. He's a bit of a rogue, a bit of a cheat, and he has an elder son called Esau. And the older son is the son that the father truly loves. And one day when Isaac's really old, he wants to pray a prayer of blessing over Esau before he dies. Such a prayer was hugely important in that social, cultural context. All of the father's hopes and dreams are going to be prayed over Esau. And the younger son, with the help of his mother, dresses up in his elder brother's clothes. The plan is a genius one because Isaac is virtually blind. So he has to rely on the senses of touch and smell. And so he gets his father's blessing. Do you know what? You and I are the equivalent of Jacob. We're the scoundrel son. But God is not tricked into blessing us like Isaac gets tricked. It's a choice he makes because he chooses to clothe us in the garments of the son he loves. Do you get the picture? We're clothed in the garments of the son the Father loves. We get clothed in the perfect righteousness of Jesus. Paul says in Galatians 3, the law is like a school teacher that leads us to Christ. The picture here is not simply of someone taking us to a person who is going to teach us a better way of living. The school teacher in Paul's day is a slave tutor who will grab his students and beat them black and blue until they have learned what is right. I think the school teacher of Paul's day is a bit like the child catcher in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Do you remember that old film? That horrible man doesn't just want to teach us. He wants to imprison and control the kids And whereas the law defines sin, don't do X, and the law provokes sin, keep off the grass, the gospel sets us free. Run, John, run, the law demands, gives me neither feet nor hands. Better news the gospel brings. It bids me fly and gives me wings. I'm changed by a new power living within me. The power of the grace of God that doesn't just forgive the past, but enables me to live a new life that pleases the Father by the power of the Holy Spirit. Did you notice in verse 4, Paul tells us that because we've died to the law, because we're now married to or united to Jesus, we have a new power within us, the power of the Spirit that enables us to bear fruit. He says this, you are now united with the one who was raised from the dead. As a result, we can produce a harvest of good deeds for God. This theme of a harvest of good deeds, bearing fruit for God, is huge in the book of Galatians. When you read the book of Galatians, this is a bunch of Gentile people, non-Jewish people who've come to faith in Jesus. And they're enjoying their Christian lives. They're loving the fact that they are saved entirely by the grace of God, not their performance. Their Christian lives are about the work of the Spirit, not keeping religious rules. But then a bunch of people from Jerusalem come down and they say, well, actually, as well as enjoying grace, there's a few rules that we think you should keep. In fact, you definitely should keep. You need to get your little boys circumcised. You need to observe Jewish festivals. You need to eat only kosher food. And all of that is not within our mindset, because I doubt very much whether there are many ethnically Jewish people here. But we as Christians can end up like those first century Galatians. We do it to ourselves. We give ourselves new lists of rules that we have to do. So the church that I grew up in preached the gospel. I was saved by the grace of God, but the moment I got saved, I had a load of rules to keep. Unless I had my daily quiet time, reading my Bible and prayer, I was in for a bad day. There were all sorts of special rules about what I could and couldn't do on a Sunday. All sorts of clothes I should or shouldn't wear, particularly if I was a lady. All sorts of hairstyles that were appropriate or not appropriate. Tattoos completely beyond the pale. Tom will remember this. In Hailsham, I once encouraged a guy to get a tattoo. You're thinking, how on earth and why on earth did you do that? Well, he was brand new Christian, and he came one Sunday morning, like many of you gentlemen are in your shorts, and he was a big Liverpool fan, which immediately earned him brownie points with me. And down his left leg, he had a full Liverpool tattoo covering the entire leg. But on his right arm, he had a rather rude picture of a naked lady. So I suggested he get a new tattoo. So he came the following week and he had a bikini on the lady. So I encouraged him. Well done. I digress. That's got nothing to do with what I'm preaching, but it's a good story. Let's talk as we finish about how we live this new life. We keep in step with the Holy Spirit. I love the fact that when Barnabas, who's one of the early church leaders, and he's a Jewish guy, but he's sent by the church in Jerusalem down to Antioch, which is the first Gentile church. And he's told, go and check it out. See if what's happening there is the real deal. See if it really is a work of God. And do you know what he sees? He sees grace. It says Barnabas came and saw grace. He saw a people free to enjoy and live in the good of all that Jesus lived, died, and rose again for. We often, in our family church values, we talk about we're a church that is a family. We're a church that's full of faith, and we're a church that believes in freedom. And freedom isn't simply freedom of worship, freedom to put our hands in the air, freedom to shout and sing. Freedom, real freedom, is freedom from performance, freedom from condemnation, freedom from guilt, freedom from shame. What does it mean for me as a follower of Jesus to live in freedom? It means that I understand I am married to the most generous, best supportive spouse on the planet. And his name is Jesus. I was married to the law. I died. I'm now married to Jesus. So I know, we sung it this morning, I am truly known and truly loved. And what we're going to do now to respond this morning is we are going to take communion together. Because we sometimes call communion, don't we, the Lord's Supper. Because when we break bread together and we drink wine together, it is a looking back at what Jesus did on the cross, but we're also looking forwards to the great wedding supper of the Lamb. So we take a little piece of bread and we take a little cup of wine and we eat and drink and we declare, I am united with Jesus. And when Jesus comes again, that reality of my union with Christ will be on public display for all together. And we will eat and drink in the most magnificent feast. This is just a little sample of a much greater feast that is to come. Let me just read to you Isaiah 25. I love this verse. In Jerusalem, the Lord of heaven's armies will spread a wonderful feast for all the peoples of the world. It will be a delicious banquet with clear, well-aged wine and the choicest of meats. And there he will remove the cloud of gloom, the shadow of death that hangs over the earth, and he will swallow up death forever. And the sovereign Lord will wipe away all tears. We are no longer married to the law. We're married to Jesus. And one day, the reality of that marriage will be on full public display for the whole universe to celebrate. Let's share communion together.